Welcome to Prose Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
All right. Hello out there, everyone in internet and podcast land. This is the Precipice Fiction pilot episode. And we're here with myself, Alex Eldridge, Ali Burnham, and Paddy Boylan. Feel free to introduce yourself, guys. I think this is how this is supposed to go. I'm not really sure.
I've seen another podcast like host says name of people. People say hello, and then it moves on. I think just so everyone can identify who the name.
I missed my jump in.
You missed your cue, Ali. You missed your cue. It's all going to shit. No, I think we're good. Well, my name is Alex Eldridge. I am a writer of horror and dark fantasy, I guess, and then some other sort of things in that niche. I'm working on my second book right now. The first one isn't published, but technically it is the second book. So that's exciting. And Ali.
Beautiful. I'm a screenwriter by trade. I've got a couple of credits floating around in feature film and animation land. But my passion projects are working on my manuscripts. I have two, one in fantasy YA, older YA, and the other's historical fiction dark comedy. I've only just started calling it recently. Neither yet published, but they're on their way.
Ali, is older young adult?
Well, if new adult was a real genre, it would be new adults. But upper end YA. So not for 12-year-olds, but perhaps your 16-year-olds.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I'm Paddy. I dabble in writing. I write science, fantasy, and I don't know, what would you call sovereignty? Other things. That's to be announced.
I tried to describe sovereignty to someone at Varuna the other day, and I really failed. I just kept saying it's really good. I can't tell you what it's about, but it's really good.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. I'm going to say social satire, but I need to write more things until I can't really say I have a genre yet until I've actually written more.
Maybe like alternate history, like this, like I don't know, depending on where it came from. But
alternate history comedy satire.
Yeah.
I'm definitely going to be talking about Disco Elysium when it comes time to chat, because that's been a massive influence.
Absolutely. I'm keen to get back into that.
Ali, you're nodding like you know what that is.
I've heard of it.
Okay, all right.
How's that do it?
I won't come in with any hard opinions on it, though.
I will come in with all the hard opinions on it.
Right.
Good.
Well, no, that's probably a good jumping off point, actually. So, what have we all been? Paddy, you mentioned Disco Elysium. So, what have you been sort of playing a lot of that? Has it been sort of influencing what you've been doing, inspiring it?
It's influenced everything I've done since I've played it. First of all, it's based on a piece of literature. The guy who made the game started out as a writer. His book's only published in Estonia. I'm waiting with bated breath for it to be published in English. It is kind of like a biting satire of ideology in the 20th century told through a non-Earth world. So you've still got the struggle between big money capitalism, fascism, communism, the melting pot, the sort of awful world that they've left behind in the 20th century slugfest, but it's not told through Earth. So in doing so, he's able to explore some pretty difficult themes about nationalism and national identity and ideology and the sticky situations that creates, while not actually saying like, this is Russia, this is America, this is the ex-Soviet Union.
I kind of like to think of it as like an MMA fight between all the different ideologies of the 20th century and just see which comes out on top.
You can critique the ideas without, going all in on Russia and making an enemy of the Russians.
Absolutely. While never actually saying like, this is X, this is Y. And as the main character, you're a sort of a drug-addled wreck of a man. You're a police detective. And you are sort of thrown into the world and you need to make ideological choices. So like if you're familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, has an alignment system, this has a big ideology system. So you can go like a little down the communist path and maybe have like a sprinkling of like
just a little bit down
free market liberalism.
Path.
Yeah. It's
that's great.
It's fascinating. And it's inspired this novel Sovereignty I'm writing a lot.
I think there's a Mac version too now, right? It's two now too.
There is, yes, yes.
Like in English. Yeah, I really want to get in on that because I played a little bit of that at your house and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And it's never fully left my thoughts ever since then. And whenever I see you, I'm like, oh, I gotta play Disco Elysium. And it just pops up on the internet all the time. Speaking of video games, I have recently started playing Dark Souls 2. And I have never played that game before. And for anyone who hasn't played it, which I don't think is anyone, it is incredibly hard. It's like if Diablo 2 were like turned up in difficulty, made sort of like a third person follower thing, and then the lore is just eked out. Like, it is so miserly. It is the most miserly game I have ever played. It will not give you anything until you like just absolutely are floundering around and you're like, anyway, I can talk about that for
Well, that's
ages.
also kind of part of the narrative of the game, right?
Very much so.
To use the term ludo narrative, which is great. Like the difficulty in you dying constantly is like threaded into the story of what's happening.
Which is really cool. Like, I like when a game can do that. Like BioShock did that a little bit, but it was
when the mechanics reflect narrative and are in conversation with each other. Yeah. No, I've only played Dark Souls as like 3-player co-op because I haven't been silly enough to do that to myself as a single player. So the three of us treat it as like a dungeon crawler together.
Nice.
So it's playable, but then every now and then our game gets invaded by like a level 100 psycho and just decimates all three of us. So that's my experience with Dark Souls.
It is very difficult. So I've been playing that and just loving that. Also, I've been reading. I've been reading recently. I started reading Farewell to Arms by Hemingway, which is very good. I'm just kind of early days into that. But my main inspiration for what I've been doing, which has been sort of like a horror ghost thing, like a haunted house story essentially, is perennially Stephen King. Like, I don't even know if he's the best writer of that, but he is inside me now, so I can't not write from that place. But I've been just going back through a series of short stories that I read of his, and that's been really good. Skeleton Crew.
I was recently talking to a friend of mine who manages a bookstore in northern Sydney, and they wanted to do like a horror section. They're like, we're going to go out of our way to curate like a horror shelf that our readers can easily find. And they loaded it with all their Stephen King books, and then they were kind of like, what else have we got? And then they genuinely really struggled to like space out or equal the Stephen King books on the shelf. And ultimately that's kind of what did in their shelf, because they're like, oh, we don't have enough. We're either going to have to order in more books, but we don't know if we'll be able to sell them. Otherwise, it just looked silly. It just looked like they had created a Stephen King shrine instead of a horror section.
I can't name another horror writer, actually. Now that I think about it, I know zero except Stephen King.
There's Lovecraft. There's I've forgotten her name.
Lovecraft.
Kingfisher, I think her name is. She's really good. There are a few out there, but really oddly niche. It's oddly niche, and I don't really know why.
Speaking of diving into the classics, so on your recommendation, Alex, I finally got around and I'm listening to Moby Dick at the moment.
Oh, nice.
I'm about a third of the way through it.
I'm actually reading it right now as well, and I'm about a third of the way through it.
It has way more humor than I was expecting.
Yes, that's exactly what I said to my brother who recommended it. It is. I thought it'd be very bleak and
dreary and moody is what I was expecting, but I'm like, this shit's funny.
Queequeg is a fucking riot. He's a great character.
First time he's introduced, he's like, bah!
So I'm really enjoying it. There's some sections definitely stick out to me more than others. Like, I'm like, that was incredibly memorable, and then like the next 10 pages I'm like, I'm not entirely certain what happened. But the parts that are memorable are incredibly memorable, and I'm having a lot of fun with it.
The antiquated language is a little difficult as well at times. Mostly it's understandable, but sometimes you have a word that just doesn't exist anymore. That can be difficult.
Yeah, I think I got lucky. So I'm listening to it on an audiobook, and the narrator's actually doing a very good job of it. I don't want to imagine how many hours of practice he's put into it to make it feel like a monologue, endless stream performance, because it is delivered so well and is quite easy to follow, which I think he's making something very difficult seem very easy.
Like when Shakespearean actors deliver Shakespeare and you know what's happening, even though when you think about it, like, I don't know what that word means. I don't know what that word means.
Yeah, there's no speed bumps at all
Yeah.
because you're just getting the meaning from the full context.
Yeah.
And he's delivering it with that same kind of cheek and charm.
Yeah.
That's very engaging. That it needs. I think in someone else's hands, it could have easily been a very serious text.
Yeah.
But this like performance choice has been made to make it quite funny.
It's one of those weird books too that like I don't know, maybe the because I know the audio experience is always very different to the physical reading experience. But going through it reading, like you'll pick it up and be like, there's a lot of things going on here. And within like a paragraph or half a page, you're completely immersed. It's one of the weirdest things I've found. Like you're just like, it takes a little bit to get into, but once you're there, you're like there and it's got you, and then the next 3 pages like, oh wow, okay. Yeah, it's so rich. So much so that I think there's like a lecture series out there that just will like walk you through the book as you go. Your brother was telling me about that, Paddy.
There's so many lectures on it. I feel like there's a lot of people that have made their whole career on just talking about Moby Dick.
Why not? What a book.
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying the language. So both of you would know from my historical fiction, I'm attempting to achieve a similar, like, kind of verbose language that
also
reminds
nautical,
you of
actually.
Also nautical. It's a good research tool. But yeah, to achieve that kind of sense that the language is from another time, but my goal is to then make sure it's not alienating at any point. So yeah, I'm having fun listening to just the different turns of phrases, even though it's not quite the right era. My historical fiction's a little bit older, but yeah, every now and then something will just be worded and I'm like, that is a great way to phrase that. I need to write that down. I need to sit with it. Yeah, so it's very insightful just for just being able to play with longer sentences and having the freedom to play with longer sentences, which I feel like we sometimes kneecap ourselves with a little bit with our contemporary writing.
Definitely. Like it's when Tom was showing me this is one of our other buddies in our writer group. He was showing me a passage the other day from Dickens where it's literally just a guy talking about how like traumatized this man's voice sounds, like how reduced the voice is, like, and it's like, and it wasn't physically reduced. It wasn't as though he's physically sick. It's just like he had the soul sucked, and it's this whole paragraph of like, this is how, terribly diminished this man's voice is because of the life he's gone through. And it was beautifully written, like fascinating.
Yes, one of my favorite sections from Moby Dick was kind of the chapter where he's arguing with people who are saying whaling's not important. So it's like a passage in the voice of like, this is what someone might say to like nag on whaling. And then he's like, how dare you? And then launches into the rebuttal. Like, I love that so much. And the charm and humor of that is also in keeping with what I hope to replicate in my work as well, like a kind of character that would argue and not shut up and just go for long rants. So I really adored that entire, it was like an entire chapter of ranting and arguing, and it was just beautiful.
It's one of the things I like about Moby Dick is it isn't afraid to take its time. It is okay with devoting a chapter to just having a character like admonish people in his head while he's in the shower or whatever. And I feel like, at least in my own writing, and I think you guys all agree, there's such a fear of boring the audience. You need to have things happening, story moving, which on paper is a really good thing to keep in mind. But then you read something like Moby Dick, or I'm going to say Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, which, I mean, speaking of being haunted by like a story that's never leaving me, that really go all in on taking their time. And I suppose because they're beautifully written, it's mesmerizing.
100%.
Yeah, it's something I'd like to explore more going forward. Just the ability to, like, you'll write something down and then you'll be like, I feel like I could expand on this, but there's a natural tendency just to go like, do they really need to hear that? And sometimes you have to remind yourself, yeah, I'm writing a book. Like, the whole point is it's my expressing how I feel about this thing. And if that takes a page, that's okay. Because certainly, I don't know about you guys, my natural tendency is definitely to truncate and go like, well, how can I say this in as few words as possible? And I think that's helpful to a degree.
It might depend on genre as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, look, if I were writing high fantasy, that would just, it'd be like, there was a tree. The tree was green. It was really nice. And that would be me.
Yeah, I find depending, so some advice I was given recently was to attempt to age up my historical fiction to help it fit more neatly on kind of like an audience I want to pitch it for. Since a lot of my, say, natural taste, I read a lot of YA, and because my fantasy work has a bit more of that YA like pacing demand, and maybe a bit more of a, I will lean on quicker action and quicker dialogue and spend maybe less time on scene setting and inner thoughts, because that's not necessarily the toolkit the readers are there for. They want to spend time on other things. But it's almost like a readjusting of focus on this other manuscript, where it's like, well, if I'm aging it up, I'm like, what does that mean mechanically? And I'm starting to learn, well, I think that means they want to spend more time with the environment. They want to spend more time in the thoughts and less time on action, less time on dialogue. And it's almost like audience dictates where you're putting that focus and which tools are going to get more time on the page, more literal word count compared to others.
It's almost like a balance between action and ideas.
Yeah.
Action is very visceral and easy to read and page turning, while ideas are something you want to sit on and meditate. I was thinking as you were saying that, the way you've written Majesty is actually very filmy. It's easy to imagine as a film. There's scenes and color and action and things happening, and film translatable.
Yeah, I think that's maybe problem's not the right word, but I think there's.
I don't know if it's a problem.
Yeah,
it's a feature.
Yeah, screenwriting is inherently obviously action and dialogue, and there are no other tools. We don't even spend that much time describing landscape, because that's technically not our job. There's a location scout who's going to go away and find a beautiful location. I just need to imply that we need trees, or it's dark, and I'll just imply the mood and then I move on, because that's not my point. I need to spend time on action and dialogue. So my very first manuscript, this fantasy one, those are naturally the tools I've leaned on. But I guess I'm finding with the historical fiction, I need to weight it differently. It needs to feel less like a screenplay. And by making it feel more like a book, that's almost aging it up. I'm using book in a loose way, but yeah, this idea that it's something a bit more literary, something that is a bit more for the adults, for the big kids. I find that funny that it's almost like screenplays inherently are a little more immature in that sense. They feel like they're for a younger youth audience, but thankfully no one sits down and reads screenplays. They're not a final product.
No,
not really designed for it.
I guess that's an attention span thing, right? When you're in the cinema, typically a lot of people, if they're a captive audience, they want it to move along.
Yeah.
Like Teenager Simulator almost.
And also screenplays are kind of written for people who don't like to read. Is one of my favorite things. Like that is the minimal words to describe anything succinctly. It's the ultimate craft of less is more. It's like, if I can get this across in a sentence, I will, and move on. You just don't have the budget to spend any more words on it than that.
Yeah, the time budget, the mental sort of budget there. It's actually sort of leaning into something we wanted to talk to a little bit there, that contrast between world building and characterization and like action. I was sort of struggling to articulate it before, but like getting the verisimilitude between the big exciting escapism sort of tropes of, say, I don't know, fantasy and things, and then getting something that's a little bit more kind of realistic, or a little bit more like, I can, let's say characters that kind of draw you in a little bit more. For an example, like finding that balance between, let's say, the exciting and then the realistic. And you mentioned, Ali, grimdark fantasy, sort of in the sense that there's the tension between this world that's very dark and sort of angsty and stuff, and people getting killed and there's bloodshed and stuff, that coming from an initial high fantasy trope of, where everyone's like beautiful and blonde, and you're in a royal court, and so I don't know, do you want to speak on that sort of dichotomy a little bit?
Yeah, no, I kind of finding where I wanted to pitch my fantasy, I kind of had to think about, so obviously a part of me is like, I want to kick all the tropes of that unrealistic high fantasy. That's not necessarily what I want to write. But then I kind of had to go on this journey of like, well, I'm not writing grimdark either, because for me, the putting realism at the forefront of grimdark to me was almost a bit of a betrayal as to why I love fantasy and why I read fantasy. It's because for me, and I think the audience I'd like to read fantasy because it is escapism and it is cool. And I feel like those are almost the two elements you're slowly stripping away if you are like at the far end of the grimdark spectrum. So for me, it was just in terms of thinking about my audience, like Grimdark that does Grimdark well, like those are masterful works. Like I'm thinking of Joe Abercrombie's stuff and the Poppy War, especially the Poppy War. That's a good kick to the guts, but I don't need to ever read those again and do that to myself again because it's not good escapism. It's like that hurt, that harmed me rather than entertained me, even though I can appreciate it as a really amazing piece of work. So something fun, I guess my personal taste is in my first draft, I kind of had a go where it's like, cool, I'm stripping away some of the stuff where it feels a bit too pantomime. I don't really want to put in the cool, like when you're just doing it deliberately for the audience, just feeding an audience, making them happy. But when I started getting some beta reader responses, they were kind of like, oh, this scene could be cooler, or like you could put a bit more of a female gaze on some of your male characters. So like, because you might be getting some, if you are YA and you've got female readers, like they need the boys to be pretty. That's a really important marketability part of your book.
Totally.
So it has been really interesting going back in my second draft, and I'm like, I need to make the magic swords a little bit cooler and less real, and I need to make some of my boys a little bit prettier. So yeah, going through and drafting specifically for that in mind, and yeah, dialing down the realism to make it a bit more fantasy and genre has been a really interesting experience.
We're all calling Grimdark more realistic. I might have a different definition of Grimdark. I don't see it as reflecting reality so much as like almost an inverse of high fantasy. Like you read Grimdark not because you want to experience like the real tumults of life, but because you want to read something that's fantastical in the other direction.
Yeah.
Like welcome to shit world and everyone suffers. Maybe this is just the how you define Grimdark question.
It's like a fantasy almost, in a sense.
It is. It's bleak fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess for me, when I'm saying realism, I guess it's stories that want to deal with, like, if there is a war, now all the characters have PTSD, right?
Yeah.
Like things are shit.
Yeah.
While a typical fantasy will have, you get gifted your amazing action sequence, and then you get gifted the amazing victory.
The
and
protagonist
there's not the consequences.
A character won't die unless they have a chance to give like a heroic kind of speech or a final poem or something before they pass away, right?
Yeah,
totally. I remember sort of rubbing up against this when I was writing my first little manuscript, which was basically sort of set in the future a little bit. And there's a guy, and he, it sort of starts off as this pulpy crime thing. But then I introduced this car into it, and it's sort of like an amazing, thing. You go really fast, and it like taps into it, and it was like this very anime sort of thing. And it was cool. And when I sent it to one of my beta readers, he was like, that was really cool. I want to see more of the car. And then I realized coming back to it, I was like, well, no, actually the bits that I liked were all like the weird little character interactions between these guys. And the car itself didn't matter as much to me. So it was kind of like, oh, I've sort of put myself, like, straddled this line between these two worlds that don't necessarily mesh, which I guess is the problem of, like blending genres, I guess, because that was sort of like sci-fi meets, what do they call it? Like cyberpunk. Well, no. Well, I mean, I guess that meshes, but it was a
vaguely cyberpunky. It was definitely an 80s throwback world.
That's it. Yeah, it was,
and
like
there were neural links into cars.
It was like 80s cyberpunk. Like it was like, I don't know, like He-Man cyberpunk almost. Anyway, but
no, that brings up a really cool question for authors. So it's like when we're doing our first draft, we know what we love about it and what's drawing us in. So say if I'm really interested in like the political goings on of this world and working out who's working with who, and that's what's got like all my juices flowing. But then a beta reader reads it and tells me they really like the magic swords. Do I then go away and be like, well, if I ever want to sell this thing, do I need to dial up the presence of the magic swords and give a little bit less attention to the political machinations, even though it was like all the politics was what seeded the idea for me in the first place. I guess it's how far you are as a writer and what you're willing to massage and change to make a commercial product, I guess.
Or maybe why you're writing, because you might not want to make a commercial product. I think there's another podcast that Alex and I listen to that we're trying to get everyone else in our little cadre to listen to called, oh my God, Alex, what's it called?
The self-publishing podcast.
The self-publishing podcast. They talk to a lot of formula writers who write romance or they write political espionage fiction. And they often talk about writing to an audience. Like, I know it's going to sell, and before I start the book, I'm going to write to try and sell books. And when I heard that for the first time, I was like, oh my God, like that's awful. Like, that's the death of art.
Yeah.
But I've been thinking about it, and maybe it's not. Maybe like a writer should question, why am I writing this? What's the ultimate goal? Am I okay if it doesn't get published, but I really, really love the story?
Yeah, like I guess for me, I want the best of both worlds, maybe because I'm greedy.
Yeah,
like I want to get out the story that I want to tell, but at the same time, I think one of its success conditions is, other people like it as well. And
how many millions of copies will it sell?
Not so much that, but for me, the end goal is always just I want to hold the physical product, and it would be really nice if I can get to the end of that
That is
journey.
the dream.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you bring up a good point there in terms of tropes and stuff, because like I know personally when I started, I was always like, less tropes. I want to do my own thing. I want to make it up. I want to invent it as we go. Yeah. But the more I get along in terms of story writing in general, I kind of almost am starting to see tropes in the way that a musician approaches, scales and chords and things. It's like there are these blocks, and you can phrase the blocks in different ways. You can put all sorts of different accents and things on them. But essentially, if you've got a car chase, it's a car chase. Whether it's a horse and cart chase, whether it's driving across a bridge, whether it's a spaceship chase, essentially it's the same fundamental unit. And that has tropes endemic with that. I guess you'd call those subtropes. And those are there for a reason, because they work really, really well. So in some sense, maybe it's about not so much ditching tropes as recontextualizing them in a way that is really fresh and interesting. So that's sort of where I've been with it lately, just kind of going like, how can I use these building blocks and put them together in such a way that is refreshing, I guess.
Yeah, when I'm talking to my students, I love phrasing it as tropes and cliches are two different things.
Yeah.
So the cliche is when it's either harmful or overused and the audience is tired of it, while the trope is just a nice little shorthand to get the audience on board really quickly. And then once that shorthand communication's happened and they're hooked, then you can do whatever you can take them wherever you want after that. Same with the difference between stereotypes and archetypes, I guess. That stereotypes are the negative ones, the ones that are potentially harmful and overdone, but archetypes are just easy shorthand, whether you're communicating with a creative team or the audience.
There's a fine line with both, though, right? Stereotypes and archetypes and tropes and cliches. I mean, going back to high fantasy, one could argue it's all very, very cliched. Like anytime you feature an elf, is that a cliche?
You've already created a massive hole you need to dig out of.
Yeah.
On
the other hand, sometimes let's say you use like high fantasy as a template, but then on top of the template, you tell a story that's really original and fresh and interesting and human and relatable. I don't know, are those ideas still cliches?
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Like an audience will never pick up, if they're not intrigued by high fantasy to start with, they're never going to pick up your high fantasy, even if you have done something amazing, fresh and original. They're like already that whole genre is overdone and a cliche to them, and they're just not going to touch it.
Probably.
While you're already speaking to the audience that's educated in high fantasy and has read all the high fantasy and are ready for something different. So you're already engaged with a niche audience.
Like I'm thinking Game of Thrones, and it's not high fantasy, but it's fantasy. It's medieval fiction fantasy. There's dragons, there's a necromancer, spoilers, there's undead. Yes, it was full of arguable cliches, but it didn't matter. It absolutely transcended that. They were just jumping off points.
Well, I'd argue that Game of Thrones is almost more like sort of War of the Roses. You know, it's like my dad's not a big fantasy buff, but he read it and he was like, "This book is amazing. You got to read it." And I was like, "Oh, isn't it like high fantasy? I didn't think you read that." And he's like, "Well, look, I think of it more in terms of just these like the political machinations that Ali was talking about before. It's like it's all these people trying to get what they want and then butting heads against each other, which you could argue is the nature of fiction in general, but it's just done in such a way that I don't know, it just had this very fresh feel to it. It like I can't exactly explain why it works, but it feels like the focus is more on how are these people and cultures and tribes interacting, and less on like, oh look, I can cast a magic spell. You know
what I think it is.
Not to disparage that, but
no.
It felt like the emphasis was put differently. To me.
I know he's a massive history buff, and a lot of what he writes, like you were saying, War of the Roses, is kind of lifted straight from history. Like, I feel like he's taken the most interesting things that have happened in European dynastic history, and just threaded that through a fantasy mold. And that's the secret sauce. That's the formula, and it's amazing. Just a lull.
It's all right. We can cut this.
Anytime there's a lull, maybe we should move on to the next segment or
totally
section. I think that's probably.
I mean, I guess the next segment we had was really reading out from our finished works. That's the next thing I had there. But hey, maybe it's time for that.
Well, it is. We've gone 3/4 of an hour, so that's
okay.
Wow. Okay.
Well, that's
that
pretty
feels
good,
right then.
Yeah, it does. Did you have anything you wanted to read out, Ali? We can always cut back on this. So
I can read something out. Want and can are two different things, but
yeah, true.
I have a little excerpt here I can read out that speaks to what I was saying before about I went and dialed up this little scene specifically for a younger audience who wanted more cool stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Well, if you want to do that, I'll dig up what I wanted to read while you're doing that.
Sure. All right. All right. Once I bring it up, I'll find a way to naturally introduce it. So we thought what we might do is share some of our struggles in our actual writing rather than dancing around. I've been working on this, but actually like bleed onto the podcast a little bit. And share some of the work and an example of what I was talking about before, this idea of something I first drafted and I didn't mind it. It suited my tastes, but after getting some beta notes and the feedback that, can the love interest be dialed up a little bit more? And can we have a bit more action? So that was not naturally my taste, but I was like, sure, I can certainly attempt to dial that up. So I was just going to read a little, I think it's a 600-word passage of where I had a go at doing that. So the big asterisk is obviously this isn't polished work. This is just an example of a little section that I've had a go at rewriting in an attempt to, write for the audience. Give the masses what they want. So we do have a little practice drill fight scene between what is the main character and I guess what is the love interest, even though I don't like using those terms. I don't know why I'm even just squeamish around putting those kind of labels on my characters, but those are the archetypes, right? Just calling them archetypes. All right. No more drills, she said, and whirled the staff over. Let's do this. Fight me. He shook his head and chuckled. Spar with Thornsbane, I'm not that dense. I need something to hit, as you said. No, you'll get too competitive. You'll need to be good competition first, she snorted and fell into a fighter's stance. With a dramatic sigh, he rose and twisted his staff over. Are we using Nebula? In response, Azura pulsed. Black mist burst from her limbs and was quickly carried away by the wind. Shade nodded. Diving in close, she forced him to block a jab to his chest. The Nebula-fueled blow would have cracked his ribs if he had missed. She grinned and twisted away before his return strike could connect with her shoulder. She reveled in the command of her full Nebula supply, and though he was trying to hide it, she could tell he was competitive too. With fluid motions, Shade avoided her every strike. He never moved further than he needed to, reading her movements exactly, content to dodge her staff only by an inch. But she didn't need to be the perfect Kurokai assassin to be better than him. Shade could fall back on his elegant clan training all he wished. Azura is more akin to a tiger dog, claiming its scraps in a frenzy. Nothing but claws, blood, and teeth. Her desire to win outweighed her need to be respected, for respect was fickle. Victories, however, were undeniable. She'd won her coronation and made an empire hate her for it, but not a single person could ever deny she'd done it. Shade pushed, using his longer reach to keep her at bay. As they clacked together, she felt the wood in her hands give. Her staff wouldn't take too many more Nebula blows. A new tactic. You really think I'm a bitch? She demanded. I shouldn't have. No, I think you're right. She got inside his reach. Their staves clapped again, as she pushed him back. You know what I did to my sister? Her parents had just died, and instead of staying with her, I ran off to kill Thorn. He feigned, and she fell for it. She took his strike in aside. No wonder she hates me, she said, breathless. She doesn't hate you, Shade replied, and almost twisted her staff from her grip. How can you know? Because all younger siblings admire their older ones, he growled. In a flash of aggression, his style changed. He brought the staff downwards with a heavy blow. She raised hers above her head and blocked. They pushed and pushed against each other, momentarily deadlocked, their breath hot in one another's faces. She met his gaze. That excuses Jackson, she mused. But what explains your obsession with me? Perhaps suddenly aware of their proximity, his gaze slid away. Her chance. She twisted her staff and swept it hard against the back of his knees. He collapsed to the dirt. Before he could roll away, she had the butt of her staff against the underside of his chin. She nudged it, forcing him to look up at her. His eyes were wide, his breathing shallow, as if landing had winded him. You got distracted, she said. He was looking at her differently, as if really looking at her for the first time. She hoped the exercise hid the flush in her cheeks. Better luck next time, Sayake. She dropped the staff so it landed on his chest. Then she returned to the caves as quickly as dignity allowed.
Nice.
It's like a film, like it's a film sequence.
Yeah. I like the way that you thread the sexual tension in there, like as part of the actual action. It's like, oh no, she's looking at me. I need to look away. Gotcha. That was a fun little. I don't know. It's just
Yeah, noted. I think that was really fun as well.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes, no, it was. I'm like, I need a sexual tension scene because my potential two love interests are never. Oh, well, good, because apparently the first draft was even subtler. So I've actually gone back and tried to put in these moments throughout the book. Yeah.
That was a good level, I thought. Cool. Well, I wanted to read a little something of mine that sort of, it's basically the book until this point is almost sort of just this like realism, like almost like small town, I guess, I don't know if it's a literary fiction, but sort of in that vein, you know, so it's like, oh, it's just a bunch of people doing people things. And this is sort of the first inkling we get that something is maybe not right, or it's, you know, something a little supernatural is going on. So we'll see how that sort of comes across. Basically, there's a family, they've gone to the Blue Mountains to their parents' house for the weekend, and they're sort of just enjoying themselves pre-Christmas. Okay. James sat, sunning himself out in the backyard the next morning. Built as it was into what was effectively a national park, the backyard sprawled out, dotted with native plants and flowers. It was as though Peter O'Malley had thrown a party and said, well, come on in then, to the native wildlife, and had never really left. The little green native bees danced around the wattle, and James could have sworn that once he'd seen a bilby. He was lounging, a beer in one hand, so what if it was 11 o'clock, this was a holiday, and a book in the other. He wasn't really reading, but reminiscing on victories, going through his mental showroom of legs, backs, and tits. He was simultaneously watching Oscar play some sort of pretend game, interstellar space travel, as if the whooshing sounds the kid made were anything to go by. Good kid. Chill-ass kid. Did he want to kid himself? No. But Oscar was good value, and he, James, was cool uncle numero uno, top spot in the avuncular sweepstakes. And that was a good place to be. A good place to role model. Everyone needed a cool uncle. Hey, he called out across the grass to the little boy. What are you doing, Oski? Playing rocket ships. I gotta get to the moon and unload my space cargo. He noticed that the little boy's face was covered in red juice from the icy pole he was clutching in his hand. James said. And tell me, Lunar Explorer Supercargo First Lieutenant Oscar O'Malley, he cocked an eyebrow, do you have a license for that icy pole? I'm not sure that particular foodstuff is regulation space appropriate. He held up an imaginary radio to his mouth and made a hacking emulation of a blast of static. Houston, we have a mess. Repeat, we have a mess. Oscar giggled. It's not an icy pole, he said. It's a paddle pop. James looked at the ice cream and the little boy was clutching in his hand. It was indeed a paddle pop. A chocolate paddle pop. The little boy raised the sweet to his mouth and sucked, and a dribble came out of it as he pulled away. But the dribble was not the brown of a chocolate paddle pop. Even at a range of 4-something meters, it was quite clearly red. In fact, the whole kid's face was covered in red. Dripping red. And it didn't looked so much like melted icy pole juice as it did. Oski, he said, "Come here, can I have a look at that paddle pop?" The boy, assuming they were still playing, shook his head. "Nuh-uh, it's mine." And when James stood up and made to reach for it, he shrieked in mirth and ran away. James put his hands on his hips. For a second, the kid's face had looked like it was covered in gore, like he'd been feeding on the carcass of some animal, eating its guts right out. He could have sworn it. A tiny little carnivore. But when the little boy returned, he saw it was indeed merely dripping brown ice cream. He grinned, shook his head. What a strange thought. Maybe you should take it easy on the beers early in the day. He poured the rest of the Heineken out on the grass. Holly would have murdered him for the beer crime, but fuck it. He put down his book, Richard Matheson's Hell House, and sat back in his deck chair. Maybe that was enough horror for one day.
Oh, that's fun.
Yes. It's just kind of getting a little bit of an intimation of something there. Like I wanted to have the little descriptor at the end just to be like, just so you know, it looks like, his face is covered in blood.
Yeah. No, it's a good signifier. You're like, no, shit. Like, I'm primed as an audience for shit to get real very soon after that.
I love going back and entering in foreshadowing. Like that's one of the most satisfying things I think to do as a writer, to go like, oh, that happened. Well, you're going to see that right here and here and here. So yeah. Cool. Well, I mean, I guess that's all. Unless Paddy, you have something you want to share?
No.
Awesome. All right. Well, I guess we can read out our little quotes and call it a day. What were you gonna read out there, Ali?
Yeah, kind of in summary of everything we've been discussing, it did make me think of one of my favorite great Terry Pratchett quotes, which is, "The first draft is just you telling yourself the story." And I do really love that. So in the similar vein of, these are the things I care about, this is why I got it, this is what's going to motivate me through 80k words. I really do love prioritizing that, and a way of not killing yourself while you're first drafting. But also then the inherent implication that then the second draft is for someone else. It is, okay, well, now I'm going to go back and think about all the things that audience needs from this, clue into what my beta readers are responding to, and maybe give them a little bit more of what they want.
Yeah, it's a good little way of, like you said, sparing yourself of that initial like, oh god, this is awful. Like, I know I don't even like to structure something out, so I'll just go through and just literally vomit on the page. Not literally, sometimes literally. I'll just sort of vomit it up on the page and then go back and look at it and go like, okay, I actually just did this recently. I did a little structure draft thing where I just asked some questions of myself and went like, oh, that's what that thing I put in there means. Okay, and then you take some things out. But yeah, in conversation with that quote, I have another one by Mr. Ernest Hemingway, where he says, "The first draft of anything is shit." So I guess that's a little bit more of the tough love side of that, but certainly a similar theme. When I read that, I was just like, oh well, look, if Hemingway thinks the first time you write anything's shit, then
it's fine.
Either he's a really hard worker or it's probably...
It reminds me of something I saw on Twitter the other day that was like, when you're giving advice to other people, it's, oh yeah, the first draft's allowed to be terrible, but then the voice inside your head's like, except mine.
Yeah.
Mine needs to be good though. And that's horrible pressure. But I'm glad Hemingway and Pratchett from Beyond the Grave are telling us that it's okay.
Yeah, very much so. Cool. Well, I think that'll probably do it. Unless Paddy, you've got a quote you want.
No, I don't. Sorry, I keep looking up. There's like the mother of all wasps on my window. It's like the size of a mug. Anyway, I'll just keep an eye on that.
Yeah,
no quote from me.
Orange fluoro boys.
Yes.
Yeah, they're terrifying.
The quote is always watch out for the big ones.
Yeah. Watch out for the big ones. That's right. Okay, cool. Well, look, that's it for the pilot episode of Precipice Fiction. I keep wanting to subtitle it On the Edge. It's so funny. The pilot of Precipice Fiction.
That took me a second to understand. I'm a little bit slow. I get it. No, that's good.
It's something. It's definitely something. But thanks for tuning in. I don't know when the next episode is going to be, but or if this one will even air. But we'll try and get back together and do something else very soon, and then hopefully next episode we'll have a proper structure and a proper schedule for
and less wasps.
Yeah, slightly less.
That'd be nice.
Cool. All right, signing off. See you later, guys.
Bye.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.